The German POWs were still laughing at the sight of unescorted American bombers when the sky suddenly went silent. A silence so unnatural even the guards froze. Then out of that stillness, silver shapes ripped through the clouds at 400 miles an hour, closing the distance like predators that had finally tasted blood. And as the POWs smirks collapsed into terror, one question hit them harder than any bomb. How did the Americans finally bring death all the way to Berlin? Quick pause before we continue. If you love uncovering the real battles, secret tactics and shocking reversals that shaped history, make sure to subscribe and like this video. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how these war stories reach history fans all over the world. Every week we bring you another untold story of courage, innovation and survival. Alright, let's get back to the front lines. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. October 1943. The rec hall smelled of cigarette smoke, weak coffee and something else. The particular mixture of boredom and bitterness that accumulated in rooms where captured men waited out wars they could no longer fight. 50 German prisoners sat at wooden tables, some playing cards, others writing letters home through Red Cross sensors, but most gathered around the bulletin board where American guards posted newspaper clippings twice weekly. Hans Muller reached the board first, scanning the headlines with the practiced eye of someone who understood what the words really meant. Former Luftwaffe ground crew chief, captured at Kasserine Pass in February, he'd spent 8 months in American custody watching the air war unfold through second-hand reports and carefully worded articles. Today's headline made him smile. 8th Air Force suffers devastating losses over Schweinfurt. Read it aloud, someone called from the back. Muller's English was best among the Alva prisoners. He read, "In the costliest mission of the war, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers in yesterday's raid on ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. An additional 17 aircraft were so severely damaged they will not return to service. Over 600 airmen are missing or confirmed killed." Army Air Force commanders declined to comment on whether deep penetration missions will continue. The room erupted in grim satisfaction. 60 in one day. Joseph Kramer slapped the table. Former Lieutenant JG-27, shot down over Tunisia after claiming 4 heavy bombers. That's 2 entire bomb groups. Gone. They called it Black Thursday, Muller continued, scanning the article. The darkest day in 8th Air Force history. Otto Steinberg leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Feldwebel, former radar operator from a Himmelbett intercept station. Of course it was. What did they expect? Sending unescorted bombers over the Reich. He shook his head. Flying coffins. That's all they are without fighter protection. The phrase caught on immediately. Fliegen Sarge. Flying coffins. The Americans don't understand air combat, Kramer said, lighting a cigarette. They think formations and machine guns can replace proper fighter escort. They think courage compensates for physics. Hans Dietrich, former Feldwebel and Mi-109 pilot with 6 kills before his capture over Sicily, moved closer to the bulletin board. He studied the article with the intensity of someone who'd actually fought American bombers. The Schweinfurt raid, that's deep penetration. Over 400 kilometers into Germany. Their thunderbolts can't reach that far. Maybe to the border, then they turn back. The golden moment, Steinberg said quietly. Everyone knew what he meant. The moment Allied escorts reached their fuel limit and had to abandon the bombers. The moment Luftwaffe fighters had been waiting for, tracked on radar, positioned for maximum effect. Muller pulled down another clipping, this one from August. Look at this. The first Schweinfurt raid, August 17th. 60 bombers lost. They stopped deep raids for 2 months after that. He looked around the room. Now they tried again. Same result. Worse even. Because the mathematics haven't changed, Dietrich said. He stood and moved to the board, gesturing like he was briefing a flight. AB-17 combat box, 18 to 21 aircraft. Each one has 13 machine guns. Looks impressive on paper. Overlapping fields of fire. Mutual support. But we found the weaknesses, Kramer interjected. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high. The nose guns can't track fast enough. Dive through at 400 miles per hour, fire a 2-second burst, break away before the top turret responds. Or the company front attack, added Werner Koch, former ground crew like Muller. 8 FW-190s approaching line abreast. The gunners have to choose targets. They panic. Fire at nothing. The entire formation saturates their defensive fire. Dietrich nodded. I flew against B-17s in June before I was shot down. 3 sorties in one day against the same raid. Attack, land, refuel, attack again. The bombers were still over Germany, still fighting, still bleeding aircraft. We could hit them repeatedly while they had nowhere to run. The POWs fell silent, remembering. Some with pride at German tactical superiority. Others with the darker knowledge of what those tactics meant. Men burning in falling bombers, parachutes that never opened, the mathematics of destruction applied with industrial efficiency. Steinberg broke the silence. The Americans keep trying the same strategy. They think if they send enough bombers, accept enough losses, they can still destroy our industry. But they're losing aircraft faster than they can replace crews. The mathematics don't work. Muller returned to the bulletin board, scanning other articles. The American newspapers were surprisingly candid about losses, probably because they couldn't hide the casualty lists from families. He found another piece dated 3 weeks earlier. Listen to this. It's from an interview with an American bomber pilot, anonymous. We know the fighters will come. We know the escorts have to turn back. We watch them go and then we're alone over Germany. You try not to think about what happens next. They know, Kramer said softly. The crews know they're being sent to die. But they keep flying, Koch observed. Why? American production can replace the aircraft, but can they replace the men? How long can they sustain 10% losses per mission? Dietrich stared at the newspaper clipping, his expression thoughtful. They're brave. Foolish but brave. Flying those missions knowing the odds. But bravery doesn't change fuel capacity. It doesn't change the fact that their Thunderbolts hit maximum range at the German border and have to turn back. Exactly, Muller agreed. And until they solve that problem, which they can't, physics is physics, the Luftwaffe will keep shooting them down. He pinned the Schweinfurt article back on the board, the headline visible to everyone in the wreck hull. 60 bombers lost. 600 men. One day. Around the room, German POWs returned to their card games and letters. Their confidence reinforced. They were captured, yes. The war might not be going well in other theaters. But in the skies over Germany, the Luftwaffe still ruled. American bombers still died in droves. The golden moment still came every mission, when escorts turned back and the hunters descended. Hans Muller sat down at his table and pulled out writing paper. He would tell his wife about the American losses, carefully worded to pass censors. He would reassure her that Germany still controlled the air, that American strategic bombing was failing, that the tide would turn. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that at that very moment in England, the first P-51 Mustangs were arriving at airfields in Essex. Within weeks, every assumption in that Oklahoma rec hall would shatter. The POWs who laughed at American losses would soon read headlines that silenced their mockery. The flying coffins were about to get an escort. All the way to Berlin. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. November 1943. The education sessions began informally over cigarettes and coffee in the rec hall. American guards allowed it, encouraged it even, believing that keeping POWs mentally engaged reduced escape attempts and disciplinary problems. What the guards didn't fully appreciate was that these discussions reinforced German confidence in ways no propaganda broadcast ever could. Joseph Kramer stood at a makeshift blackboard, chalk in hand, diagramming the tactics that had made him a decorated Luftwaffe pilot before a lucky P-38 caught him over Tunisia. Around him, 30 prisoners watched. Some former aircrew, others ground personnel or infantry who'd watched the air war from below but never fully understood its mechanics. The Americans think formations equal safety, Kramer began, sketching a rough representation of a B-17 combat box. 21 bombers arranged in 3 dimensions, high squadron, lead squadron, low squadron. Each aircraft carries 13.50 caliber machine guns. On paper, this creates overlapping fields of fire covering every angle of approach. He tapped the diagram. In theory, no fighter can attack without entering a kill zone. The Americans trained their crews to believe this. They published studies showing that tight formations reduced losses. But, prompted Hans Dietrich from the front row. But theory and reality are different things. Kramer drew approach vectors from multiple angles. First weakness, the nose. B-17s have limited forward armament, just 2 guns in early models, barely effective against a fighter diving from 12 o'clock high at 400 miles per hour closing speed. The cockpit is exposed. The engines are vulnerable. A 2-second burst from 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns can kill the pilots, destroy engines, and cripple the aircraft before the nose gunner even acquires the target. Otto Steinberg nodded. I tracked these attacks on radar. The head-on approach became standard by mid-1943. Herzer, Nock, Philipp, all the top bomber destroyers perfected it. Kramer continued. Second weakness, ammunition. Those 13 machine guns sound impressive until you calculate fire duration. Each gun carries approximately 500 rounds. At 800 rounds per minute, that's less than 40 seconds of continuous fire per gun. Bombers fly 4-hour missions into Germany. They cannot afford to waste ammunition on defensive fire. He drew multiple fighter symbols approaching from different angles. So we developed the company front attack. 8 fighters approaching line abreast, all at 12 o'clock level. The closing speed is 600 miles per hour, combined fighter and bomber speeds. The gunners have 3 seconds to identify, target, and fire. They face 8 simultaneous threats. Which do they shoot at? All of them, said Werner Koch. They panic and fire at everything, hitting nothing. Exactly. The formation's defensive fire scatters. Individual fighters only face a fraction of the theoretical firepower. We break through, destroy 1 or 2 bombers and egress before they can coordinate a response. Hans Muller raised his hand. What about the fighter escort? The thunderbolts and lightnings. Kramer's expression hardened. This was the key, the fundamental weakness that made everything else possible. The P-47 Thunderbolt, he said, writing the designation on the board, has a maximum range of 475 miles with internal fuel. With drop tanks, which they started using in August, that extends to 575 miles. Combat radius, accounting for fighting and reserves, is approximately 375 miles. He drew a rough map of Western Europe. From English bases to the German border is 350 miles. The Thunderbolts can reach the border, provide escort for perhaps 20 minutes over Germany, then must turn back. Any target deeper than the Ruhr Valley is beyond their protection range. Steinberg stood and moved to the map. I can tell you exactly how we exploited this. Freya radar stations tracked incoming raids from 150 kilometers away. We calculated bomber speed, heading, and composition. We identified the target, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, whatever. Then we calculated where the American escorts would reach maximum range and have to turn back. He traced an invisible line across the map. We called it the golden moment. The Thunderbolts would waggle their wings, a farewell to the bombers they were abandoning, and turn west. The bomber crews would tighten formation. They knew what was coming. And we would attack. Why didn't the Americans just use twin-engine fighters with longer range? Asked a young Gefreiter from the back. They tried, Kramer answered. The P-38 Lightning has better range than the Thunderbolt, about 450 miles combat radius. But it suffered catastrophic problems in European conditions. The twin Allison engines couldn't handle high-altitude cold. Controls froze. Engines failed. Pilots called it the fork-tailed devil, but not in admiration, in frustration. By autumn 1943, Lightning units were being reassigned to ground attack and reconnaissance. Dietrich added his perspective as a former fighter pilot. I flew against P-38s twice before I was shot down. They were fast in a straight line but couldn't turn with our 109s. At altitude, where bomber escort happens, they were struggling just to stay airborne. One kill I claimed was a P-38 that simply fell out of formation with both engines dead. I didn't even need to fire. Kramer returned to the blackboard, writing numbers with emphasis. So the mathematics are simple and brutal. A bomber mission to Schweinfurt, 400 kilometers into Germany, faces this reality. 90 minutes of flying with escort, 180 minutes without. The Luftwaffe can attack, land, refuel, and attack again while the bombers are still over Germany. Some of our pilots flew 3 or 4 sorties against the same raid. The Americans can't solve this, Steinberg said flatly. It's not a training problem or a tactics problem. It's physics. No single-engine fighter has the range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The fuel capacity simply doesn't exist. Mueller leaned forward. What about new aircraft? New designs? Development takes years, Kramer replied. The P-47 and P-38 are what they have. They're trying to extend range with larger drop tanks, but there are limits. You add fuel, you add weight. You add weight, you reduce performance. A fighter carrying enough fuel to reach Berlin would be too heavy to fight effectively once there. The room fell quiet as prisoners absorbed the implications. Werner Koch broke the silence. So the Americans have a choice. Send bombers deep into Germany unescorted and accept massive losses, or limit missions to targets within fighter range and abandon strategic bombing. Either way we win, Dietrich said. If they keep sending unescorted bombers, we bleed them until they run out of crews. If they stop deep penetration raids, they can't destroy our war production. Black Thursday proved this. 60 bombers lost in one day. That's unsustainable. Kramer nodded slowly. The Americans are brave. Their crews keep flying even knowing the odds. But bravery doesn't change fuel capacity. It doesn't extend fighter range. Until they solve physics, which they cannot, the Luftwaffe controls the skies over Germany. He set down the chalk and lit a cigarette. That's why I'm confident even as a prisoner. That's why we can read about Schweinfurt and know the outcome was inevitable. The Americans built an air force around strategic bombing, but they cannot protect their bombers where it matters most. Around the room, heads nodded. The analysis was sound. The mathematics irrefutable. The historical precedent clear. Black Thursday, the August Schweinfurt raid, dozens of smaller disasters. Hans Mueller stared at the crude map on the blackboard, at the line representing the maximum range of American escorts, at the vast expanse of German airspace beyond that line where bombers flew alone and died in flames. Physics is physics, he said quietly. The Americans cannot change that. Every man in the room agreed. They were wrong. At that moment, in a classified hangar at Boxted Airfield in Essex, mechanics were performing final checks on aircraft that would render every calculation, every assumption, every confident assertion in that Oklahoma rec hall completely obsolete. The P-51 Mustang had arrived in England. And physics was about to be rewritten. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. Late November 1943. The stories came out at night after the Americans dimmed the barracks lights but before sleep took over. Hans Dietrich would lie on his bunk and remember the sky over Sicily, not the moment the P-38 caught him from above, but the weeks before when the Messerschmitt Bf 109 under his hands felt invincible. June 11th. He said into the darkness. My third kill. AB-17 separated from formation. Engine trouble, maybe flak damage. It was limping home alone over the Mediterranean. Other prisoners shifted in their bunks, listening. These stories had become ritual, a way to hold on to the men they'd been before capture, before barbed wire and American rations and the slow corrosion of waiting. I came from the sun. Classic approach. The tail gunner never saw me until I opened fire. 4-second burst. The vertical stabilizer disintegrated. The fortress went into a flat spin. I counted 9 parachutes before I had to break off. 9, someone repeated. 4 didn't make it out. Joseph Kramer's voice came from across the barracks. February 26, 1943. My first heavy bomber, AB-24 Liberator over Tunisia named Maisie. I remember because the name was painted on the nose in bright yellow letters. Head-on attack 12 o'clock high. I aimed for the cockpit. The pilots never had a chance. Silence then. How many seconds? 2. Maybe 3. Then I was through the formation and gone. Otto Steinberg, who'd watched the air war from ground radar stations rather than cockpits, offered a different perspective. From the Himmelbett station we could see it all on the scopes. The bomber streams coming in, tight formations disciplined. Then the Jagdgeschwader would engage and the formations would start to fragment. Individual contacts breaking away, altitude dropping. Some would blink off the screen entirely. Just gone. The burning ones fell slowest, Dietrich said. Like leaves in autumn spiraling down. You could watch them for minutes sometimes trailing smoke all the way to the ground. Werner Koch had been ground crew not air crew but he'd seen the results up close. The pilots would return and describe the kills clinically. Bomber destroyed at 1,415 hours, Grid reference such and such. But I saw their gun camera footage. The B-17s coming apart in midair. Wings separating. Fuselages breaking. Men falling without parachutes because they never had time to bail out. Or because the parachutes burned, added another voice from the darkness. Or because they were already dead, Kramer finished. The barracks fell quiet. They were remembering dominance, yes, but also the human cost of that dominance. The Americans who died in those burning fortresses falling like leaves over German soil. Black Thursday, Muller said finally. 60 bombers in one day. That's over 600 men. In one day. How many do you think we killed in total? The Luftwaffe, I mean. Over Germany. No one answered. The mathematics were too grim even for the victors. It doesn't matter, Dietrich said. What matters is that we proved strategic bombing doesn't work. Not without fighter escort. Not against a capable air defense. The Americans learned that lesson in blood. They'll stop the deep penetration raids, Koch predicted. They have to. The losses are unsustainable. Or they'll keep trying, Steinberg countered, and we'll keep shooting them down until they run out of bombers or crews or national will. Hans Dietrich stared at the ceiling of the barracks, remembering Sicily, remembering the sky when it belonged to Germany. Either way, he said quietly, the sky over the Reich is ours. That hasn't changed. That won't change. In the darkness, heads nodded agreement. The sky they remembered, the sky of burning fortresses and spinning wreckage and parachutes that never opened, was the only sky they could imagine. They couldn't conceive of a different sky. One where German fighters were the hunted instead of the hunters. But that sky was coming. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. December 1943. Hans Muller was mopping the administrative building hallway when he first heard it. The American guards didn't usually talk freely around prisoners, but these two were young, excited, careless with their voices. Says here they flew all the way to Kiel. That's what, 400 miles into Germany. More like 450. And they still had fuel to fight. The crowds didn't know what hit them. Muller kept mopping, head down, ears sharp. His English was good enough to catch most conversations if he stayed quiet and invisible. What kind of fighter was it again? P-51 Mustang they're calling it. Supposed to have twice the range of a Thunderbolt. The guards moved down the hall, voices fading. Muller finished mopping mechanically, mind racing. He found Joseph Kramer in the rec hall an hour later. I overheard something, Muller said quietly in German. The Americans are talking about a new fighter. They claim it escorted bombers to Kiel. Kramer looked up from his chess game. Kiel? That's impossible. No single-engine fighter has that range. That's what they said. Called it a Mustang. Mustang? Kramer frowned. I've heard of that. The British used them for low-altitude reconnaissance. They were adequate at ground level but useless above 15,000 feet. Not suitable for bomber escort at all. Otto Steinberg joined them, catching the tail end of the conversation. You're talking about the Allison engine variant. Completely different aircraft than what the British are using now. The new ones have Merlin engines. Still, Kramer insisted, the physics don't change. A single-engine fighter with the fuel capacity to reach Kiel and return? While carrying ammunition and reserves for combat. The weight alone would make it unmaneuverable. That evening, more prisoners gathered as word spread. Hans Dietrich was particularly dismissive. American propaganda, he declared. They need to boost morale after Black Thursday. So they invent stories about wonder weapons. A fighter that can escort bombers deep into Germany? Impossible. I flew fighters. I know the fuel consumption rates, the weight penalties of external tanks, the performance degradation at combat load. The P-47 already carries drop tanks, Werner Koch pointed out. And it still can't reach beyond the German border, Dietrich countered. Drop tanks help but they're limited. You need fuel for the flight out, fuel for combat and fuel for the return. The mathematics don't work for deep penetration. They never will. Over the next week the rumors persisted. Guards mentioned escort missions to Bremen, to Münster. The prisoners dismissed each report with growing irritation. If this miracle fighter exists, Kramer said during one discussion, why didn't they use it at Schweinfurt? Why accept 60 bomber losses if they had an aircraft capable of escorting them? Because it doesn't exist, Dietrich answered. Or it exists but can't do what they claim. The Americans are desperate. They're losing the air war over Germany and they know it. So they manufacture hope. Mueller wanted to believe his fellow prisoners. The alternative was too disturbing. That American engineering had somehow solved a problem German aviation considered unsolvable. Even if this Mustang is real, Steinberg said carefully, even if it has better range than the Thunderbolt, it cannot reach Berlin. That's 600 miles from England. No fighter can carry that much fuel and still fight effectively. Exactly, Kramer agreed. Berlin is sanctuary. The deepest raids the Americans have attempted are Schweinfurt and Regensburg, 400 miles maximum. Berlin is 50% farther. Physically impossible. The prisoners nodded, confidence restored. The rumors were just that, rumors. American morale building. Exaggeration of minor improvements to existing aircraft. The sky over Germany remained German. The golden moment remained golden. Hans Mueller wanted to believe this. But something about the guards' excitement, the genuine enthusiasm in their voices, troubled him. They hadn't sounded like men repeating propaganda. They'd sounded like men who'd seen proof. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. December 1943. The newspaper clipping appeared on the bulletin board on December 18th. Hans Mueller read it 3 times before calling the others over. New fighter escorts bombers deep into Germany. The article was brief, carefully worded to avoid giving away tactical details, but the implications were unavoidable. American P-51 Mustang fighters had escorted B-17s to Bremen, over 300 miles into German territory, and engaged Luftwaffe interceptors over the target itself. Bremen, Joseph Kramer said slowly, studying the map someone had sketched on the rec hall wall. That's well beyond Thunderbolt range. If this is accurate. It's propaganda, Hans Dietrich interrupted, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Exaggerated claims. The escorts probably reached the German coast and turned back. The article makes it sound like they flew all the way to Bremen. Otto Steinberg tapped the newspaper. It specifically says, engaged enemy fighters over the target. That means they were still there during the bombing run. Thunderbolts would have turned back 30 minutes before target approach. Then it's a different kind of mission, Dietrich insisted. Maybe a short-range target near the coast that they're calling Bremen for security reasons. Maybe. Another article appeared 3 days later. This one included more details. P-51 Mustangs from the 354th Fighter Group had escorted bombers to Kiel on December 13th. The fighters had engaged Me-109s and FW-190s, claiming multiple kills, and had stayed with the bombers throughout the return flight. Werner Koch measured the distance on their crude map. Kiel is 450 miles from England. That's Thunderbolt maximum range, not combat radius. These Mustangs flew there, fought and came back. The rec hall fell quiet. The prisoners exchanged glances, confusion mixing with the first traces of unease. How? Kramer asked. Even with drop tanks, the fuel capacity required to fly 900 miles round-trip plus combat reserves. The aircraft would be too heavy to fight effectively. A third article arrived after Christmas. This one included a quote from an American bomber pilot. For the first time we had little friends all the way to the target and all the way home. The Jerrys didn't know what to do. They kept looking for the escorts to turn back and we just kept coming. Mueller read the quote aloud in German, then again in English to make sure he'd translated correctly. Why are the escorts still there? He said, voicing the question that hung over the entire room. The Luftwaffe tactics depend on the golden moment, when escorts turn back. But if the escorts don't turn back... Hans Dietrich stood abruptly. This doesn't make sense. We know fighter range limitations. We know fuel consumption rates. We know combat physics. A fighter cannot escort bombers 450 miles into Germany and return. It's impossible. And yet, Steinberg said quietly, pointing at the newspaper, they're doing it. Another prisoner, a former FW-190 pilot named Friedrich Weber, spoke up. What if they've developed new drop tank technology? Larger capacity, better aerodynamics. Even so, Kramer calculated aloud, the weight penalty would be enormous. A Mustang carrying that much fuel would handle like a transport aircraft. Our fighters would tear them apart. Then why aren't they? Koch asked simply. No one answered. The newspapers kept coming. Munster. Osnabrück. Each mission deeper than Thunderbolts could reach. Each time the P-51 stayed with the bombers throughout the mission. By year's end, the confident explanations had dried up. The dismissals rang hollow. The prisoners gathered around the bulletin board in silence now, reading reports of escort missions that shouldn't have been possible. Maybe, Muller said finally, we miscalculated something. Maybe American engineering found a solution we didn't anticipate. Dietrich shook his head stubbornly. Physics is physics. You cannot cheat fuel consumption. But the newspapers told a different story. The escorts were staying. The golden moment was disappearing. And the German POWs who'd been so certain of Luftwaffe dominance were beginning to realize that something fundamental had changed in the sky over Europe. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. March 6, 1944. Hans Muller stood frozen in front of the bulletin board, the newspaper shaking slightly in his hands. Behind him, the rec hall had gone completely silent. No card games, no conversation, no sound except breathing and the distant clatter of kitchen work. The headline was impossible. Mustangs escort bombers to Berlin. First American fighters over Nazi capital. Joseph Kramer reached the board second, reading over Muller's shoulder. His face went pale. Berlin, he whispered. That's 600 miles from England. Hans Dietrich snatched the paper from Muller's hands, scanning the article with desperate intensity, searching for the error, the exaggeration, the propaganda twist that would make this make sense. In a historic mission yesterday, P-51 Mustang fighters from the 8th Air Force escorted heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back, marking the first time American fighters have appeared over the German capital. Luftwaffe resistance was described as confused and sporadic, with enemy fighters apparently unprepared for the presence of American escorts so deep inside Germany. No, Dietrich said flatly. This is impossible. Berlin is sanctuary. It's beyond the range of any Allied fighter. This is propaganda. It has to be. But Otto Steinberg was already at their sketched map, measuring distances with his fingers. Berlin is 580 miles from England. Round trip is 1,160 miles minimum. Plus combat reserves. Plus ammunition weight. Plus. He trailed off, staring at the numbers he'd written. Werner Koch grabbed another newspaper from the pile the guards had just delivered. There's more. March 4th, another Berlin raid. March 8th, scheduled for tomorrow. They're not just claiming they reached Berlin once. They're going back. Repeatedly. The room erupted in confused voices, all speaking German, all asking variations of the same question. How? Friedrich Weber, the former FW-190 pilot, pushed through the crowd. Let me see that. He read the article carefully, then looked up, his expression shaken. It mentions specific fighter groups. The 4th, the 354th, the 357th. It names pilots. It describes engagements over Charlottenburg and Tempelhof. These are real details, not propaganda generalities. Then the details are wrong, Dietrich insisted. Or the reporters are confused about locations. Maybe they escorted to Brandenburg or Potsdam and called it Berlin for the headlines. Read this part, Muller interrupted, pointing to a quote in the article. It was from a captured German pilot interviewed by American intelligence. The American fighters were everywhere. We expected them to turn back before the target as they always do. But they stayed. Over Berlin itself they stayed. We could not believe what we were seeing. The rec hall went dead silent again. That's one of ours, Koch said quietly. A Luftwaffe pilot. Confirming it. Over the next week more evidence arrived. Letters from the Red Cross contained carefully censored news from Germany. Prisoners received messages from families describing American fighters over Berlin, over Munich, over targets that had been untouchable just months before. A newly arrived POW, captured in Italy in February, brought first-hand accounts. Before I was captured, we heard stories from pilots rotating back from Germany. They said the Americans had a new fighter that could go anywhere. They said the golden moment was gone. Gone. Kramer's voice was hollow. They don't turn back anymore. The Mustangs stay with the bombers from England to target and back. Our fighters have to engage with American escorts present the entire time. The tactics we developed, waiting for the escorts to leave, don't work anymore. Hans Dietrich sat down heavily, still clutching the newspaper. 600 miles. Berlin. The capital of the Reich, the deepest target imaginable, the one place that was supposed to be beyond American reach. The sanctuary is gone, he said quietly. Around him, former Luftwaffe personnel nodded slowly, the reality settling over them like a physical weight. Every assumption about fighter range, every calculation about fuel consumption, every confident assertion about American limitations, all of it obsolete. Otto Steinberg spoke what they were all thinking. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere in Germany. There is no safe distance anymore. No golden moment. The entire tactical doctrine we built, it's worthless. Allied air superiority was absolute. Luftwaffe opposition consisted of two German fighter aircraft observed over the invasion beaches during daylight hours. Muller stopped reading. The silence was complete. 2, Joseph Kramer whispered. 2 fighters. Over the largest invasion in history. Hans Dietrich grabbed the newspaper, scanning frantically for the error, the misprint, the clarification that would make the number make sense. This can't be right. Normandy is 200 kilometers from Luftwaffe bases. We had hundreds of fighters in France. Hundreds. Had, Otto Steinberg said quietly. Past tense. Friedrich Weber's voice was hollow. I fought in France before my capture. We had 3 full Jägerschwader within range of Normandy. Over 300 aircraft. And they sent 2. Werner Koch had the explanation, bitter as poison. No fuel. The wheel plants, remember? They can't fly what they can't fuel. The aircraft are there, grounded, while 150,000 Allied soldiers land unopposed from the air. Another prisoner, a former Wehrmacht infantryman, spoke up. My brother's unit is in France. His last letter, before the censors would have stopped it, mentions seeing Allied fighters everywhere. He wrote, the sky belongs to them now. We only move at night. The POWs stared at the newspaper. 2 fighters. Against 5,000 ships and countless aircraft. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in 1940, which had seemed invincible just 18 months ago, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Americans did this, Kramer said. Not angry. Just stating fact. The Mustangs. Escorting bombers to the oil plants, hunting our fighters, making it impossible to train replacements or conserve fuel for critical operations. Muller folded the newspaper carefully. We mocked their unescorted bombers. We called them flying coffins. And they fixed the problem, Steinberg finished. They adapted. They engineered a solution. And we. He gestured at the paper at the number 2 at the death certificate of the Luftwaffe printed in black and white. Hans Dietrich sat down heavily. 4 months he'd clung to German superiority, to tactical excellence, to the belief that Allied success was temporary. The invasion proved otherwise. 2 fighters over Normandy. The war in the air was over. Germany had lost. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. Summer 1944. The Red Cross letters came in bunches, heavily censored, weeks or months delayed. But they came. Hans Muller received one from his wife in July, written in May, portions blacked out by German military censors who'd reviewed it before allowing it to leave the country. He read it 3 times before sharing it with the others. The raids come almost daily now. We hear the bombers, but we also hear the fighters, ours and theirs. The American ones stay the entire time. Censored, says his unit barely flies anymore. Censored. The sky is full of them, Hans. Everywhere we look. Joseph Kramer received a letter from his younger brother, a recently qualified fighter pilot. The censors had been thorough, but the message came through in what wasn't said. I have completed training but, censored. Many of my classmates, censored. We wait for censored. The fuel situation, censored. I think of you often and hope America is treating you well. He's grounded, Kramer said flatly. Qualified but not flying. No fuel for new pilots. Otto Steinberg's letter from his sister was more explicit, perhaps because she didn't understand military security. Cousin Wilhelm came home on leave last month. He won't talk about his squadron, but Mother heard him crying at night. He goes back next week. He told Father he doesn't think he'll survive another month. The American fighters are everywhere, he said. Everywhere. Hans Dietrich's letter contained a single devastating sentence from his father, a retired Luftwaffe officer. Your old comrades from JG-27, censored. The young ones refuse, censored. I do not blame them. Werner Koch read it over Dietrich's shoulder. Refusing to fly. German pilots refusing orders. Can you blame them? Friedrich Weber held his own letter unopened. We would send them up in obsolete aircraft with minimal fuel, against Mustangs that have every advantage. It's not combat. It's execution. Around the rec hall, prisoners read similar stories. Families describing constant air raids. Brothers and sons in the Luftwaffe who came home changed, broken, or didn't come home at all. Cities where Allied fighters appeared daily unchallenged. A newly arrived POW, captured in France in July, confirmed everything. I saw pilots refuse missions. Entire squadrons grounded because commanders wouldn't send men to die pointlessly. The Americans own the sky. Anyone who flies is dead within weeks. Muller stared at his wife's letter. The sky is full of them. 6 months ago he'd mocked American bombers as flying coffins. He'd celebrated Luftwaffe dominance. He'd been confident that German air superiority was unshakable. The letters told a different story. The sky his wife saw, the sky over Germany, belonged to America now. The Mustangs were everywhere. And German pilots, the ones who'd once terrorized Allied bombers, were refusing to fly rather than face them. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. August 1944. Hans Muller sat alone in the rec hall, staring at the bulletin board where a year ago he'd read about Schweinfurt with satisfaction. Now the headlines told a different story. 8th Air Force flies 1,000 bomber raids, and Luftwaffe resistance minimal. Joseph Kramer found him there. You're thinking about what we said last October. Flying coffins, Muller replied quietly. We called them flying coffins. They were. Without escorts. So the Americans fixed the problem. Muller turned to face Kramer. We identified their weakness, lack of fighter range. We built tactics around exploiting it. We were winning. And instead of accepting defeat, they engineered a solution. Hans Dietrich joined them, his confidence from months earlier completely gone. I've been thinking about that. We had superior tactics, superior pilots, years of combat experience. We should have won the air war. But we didn't adapt, Otto Steinberg said, entering the conversation. When the Mustang appeared, what did we do? Made excuses. Called it impossible. Refused to believe American engineering could solve the range problem. Werner Koch nodded. While we denied reality, they were building more Mustangs, training more pilots, targeting our oil production. They identified our weaknesses, fuel dependency, pilot replacement rates, and exploited them systematically. Friedrich Weber spoke with the authority of a former combat pilot. The Americans learned from us. In 1943 they flew straight and level formations, predictable tactics, no fighter support. We slaughtered them. But they studied their failures. They adapted their doctrine. They built the aircraft they needed rather than the aircraft they had. And we? Kramer asked bitterly. We kept flying the same missions with dwindling fuel and decreasing numbers, expecting different results. Muller stood and walked to the bulletin board. He unpinned the October 1943 article about Schweinfurt, the one that had made them so confident. I was arrogant. We all were. We saw American losses and assumed they were incompetent. We never considered they might be learning. They were braver than we gave them credit for, Dietrich admitted. Flying those missions knowing they'd face fighters without escort. Accepting catastrophic losses while they developed a solution. That's not incompetence. That's determination. An American guard passed by, young, probably the same age as the German prisoners. Koch watched him go, then spoke quietly. We underestimated them completely. Not just their industry or engineering. Their willingness to adapt, to learn from failure, to solve problems instead of making excuses. Steinberg added, Germany's air doctrine was built on 1940 victories. 5 years later we were still fighting the same way. The Americans rebuilt their entire strategy in 18 months. The POWs sat in silence, confronting truths they'd avoided for months. They'd mocked America's weakness while missing America's strength. Not military power, but the capacity to recognize failure and change course. We should have respected them, Muller said finally. From the beginning. The others nodded. Respect earned through bitter recognition. The enemy they'd underestimated had outthought, outbuilt, and outfought them. Not through superior tactics or courage. Through adaptation. POW Camp Alva, Oklahoma. September 1944. The conversation started accidentally. Hans Muller was repairing a fence with Corporal James Wilson, a guard from Michigan who'd proven friendlier than most. Wilson mentioned his brother flew P-51s over Germany. The Mustang, Muller said carefully in English. We did not think it was possible. The range. Wilson set down his hammer. You know what's funny? The British designed the engine. We built the airframe. Neither country could have done it alone. What do you mean? The original Mustang, the one with the Allison engine, couldn't escort bombers. Wrong engine for high altitude. But some British test pilot flew it and said, put our Merlin engine in this American airframe. That combination, British power, American design, that's what beat you. Joseph Kramer, working nearby, had been listening. So it was collaboration. Everything's collaboration, Wilson replied. You know how many factories built P-51 parts? Hundreds. Companies that made cars, refrigerators, radios, all retooled for war production. My hometown made propeller components. Town next over made fuel tanks. It all came together in California, then shipped to England. Otto Steinberg joined the conversation. In Germany we had talented engineers. Good designs. But production was scattered, bombed, disrupted. That's the thing, Wilson said. You had great individual planes. The Me-262 jet, the FW-190. But we had better systems. Better production. Better logistics. He paused. Better partners. The British gave us the engine. We gave them the airframe. We shared intelligence, tactics, resources. Werner Koch asked the question quietly. You think that is why you are winning? Not technology but cooperation. That's exactly why we're winning. Germany's fighting alone. We've got Britain, Canada, Australia, the Soviets. Hell, even your own prisoners are helping us understand your tactics. Wilson gestured around the camp. You guys have been pretty open about how the Luftwaffe operated. That intelligence goes back to our pilots. Hans Dietrich had approached during the conversation. We told you our tactics? Not classified stuff. But yeah, pilots here have talked about German formations, attack patterns, radio procedures. It helps our guys survive. The prisoners exchanged glances. They'd been sharing information without realizing it, casual conversations that seemed harmless but collectively painted a picture of Luftwaffe operations. The Mustang isn't just a plane, Wilson continued. It's a symbol. British engine, American manufacturing, Allied cooperation, industrial capacity you couldn't match. That's what we brought to this war. Not just better fighters but better teamwork. Muller translated for the prisoners whose English was weaker. The Americans hadn't just out-engineered Germany. They'd out-collaborated, out-produced, and out-adapted them. Your brother, Kramer asked Wilson. He flies over Germany. Does he know what it's like for our pilots now? Wilson's expression softened. He knows. Says most German fighters don't even engage anymore. Just run. Can't blame them. The POWs returned to work in silence, understanding settling over them. They'd lost to a system, not just a weapon. The P-51 Mustang became more than a fighter aircraft. It symbolized what happened when democracies collaborated, British engineering married to American manufacturing, creating something neither nation could achieve alone. It proved that innovation under pressure could reverse seemingly inevitable defeat. It demonstrated that identifying problems mattered less than solving them. The Mustang changed strategic bombing from suicide mission to sustainable campaign. It transformed air superiority from temporary advantage to permanent dominance. It forced an entire enemy air force into fuel starvation and tactical irrelevance. Most importantly, it showed that adapting faster than your opponent mattered more than initial superiority. The German POWs who'd mocked unescorted bombers learned that lesson the hard way. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers to Berlin. It escorted Allied victory to an inevitable conclusion. October 1943. German POWs gathered around newspaper clippings, laughing at American losses. Flying coffins they called them. 60 bombers lost in a day. Black Thursday. Proof of Allied failure. March 1944. The same POWs stood in stunned silence, reading about Mustangs over Berlin. The transformation took 4 months. 4 months for American engineering to solve what German tactics had exploited. 4 months to turn hunters into hunted, sanctuary into target, confidence into despair. The POWs who'd celebrated Luftwaffe dominance learned a lesson that transcended warfare. You can mock your enemy's weakness. You can exploit their failures. You can build entire strategies around their limitations. But you should never, ever, underestimate their ability to adapt, innovate, and return stronger than before. The Mustang proved it. Berlin proved it. History proved it.